In Essential Task 7.7, we are going to describe the essential characteristics of what is called cognitive learning. Now, this is a little bit unique. When I look at the entirety of this unit, everything under behavioral psychology is in this overarching category here. So classical conditioning, that flowchart, the reward punishment system of operant conditioning here, and then even here, and then finally all the way to the right, the essential task that we most recently did, the observational learning essential task. Isolated outside of the category of behavioral psychology is what's called cognitive learning. Cognitive learning is going to introduce a series of theories or thoughts regarding learning that articulates that cognition has some impact on learning. Now, up to 7.7, so 7.1 through 7.6, we have yet to, in any capacity, reference thinking. As a matter of fact, we began the unit defining behavioral psychology with a giant no sign in the front of the thinker statue or Mr. Cognition. So we have made it an effort not to talk about cognition in any capacity this unit. Well, there are a handful of potential learning theories that do in some capacities relate to cognition. We're going to briefly talk about the first one, latent learning, today. So the essential task is the 3 boxes that you see here, which is why I recommend vertical. You can pause the video here before we progress into those 3 boxes. But as I referenced, there is one theory, one type of learning that we need to talk about that does not really fit any of the other theories. If we were to resurrect some of the classic behavioral psychologists from this unit, like B.F. Skinner, he's sort of the all-star of operant conditioning, he would vehemently disagree with this. He would have no agreement in any capacity with what we are about to talk about. So some of the classic behavioral psychologists, the all-stars of this unit, are not in agreement in any of the things that we're about to talk about. But nevertheless, we do need to address what's called latent learning, because it articulates the notion that there are at least some forms of learning that are not based on that flowchart from classical conditioning, are not based on rewards and punishments, and are not based on observing and imitating. And if we cannot classify a learned behavior into any of those 3 categories, perhaps we need to open ourselves up to the possibility of cognitive learning, which articulates the argument that there are some behaviors that do depend on at least some degree of cognition. And the big example is latent learning. We're going to connect latent learning to Edward Tolman, who gets a contributing letter C. The idea of latent learning is pretty simple, but it's the notion that you may learn something at a point in your life, and if nobody asks you about it, nobody tests you on it, you might unknowingly possess this knowledge that you don't really recognize until a later point in life. So it's not immediately reflected in your behavior. And what that essentially means is maybe you went off to Italy when you were 10 years old with your family. And at that point in life, you didn't really know a lot of Italian. You didn't really even know a lot of Spanish or other foreign languages, as a matter of fact. You sort of just only knew English. But you picked up on a little Italian and you didn't realize it. And it wasn't until your honeymoon at the age of 35 that you realized in your second trip to Europe, I recognize some of this vocabulary. I actually recognize some of the Italian. I had no idea that I learned it at 10 years old. And now 25 years later, I recognize at least a little bit of it. That would be a good example of latent learning, because learning language is not something that fits that flowchart. The classical conditioning flowchart does not do a good job explaining that. It simply doesn't explain language. You were never rewarded for speaking Italian. It's not like you took a math test on it or a science test or anything like that. It's not like it was in school, right? There's no Italian. So you were never rewarded for it. You were never punished for not knowing Italian. You didn't quite imitate and observe, because perhaps when you were 10 years old, you weren't trying to replicate the language that you were hearing. You were just hearing it. So you were never replicating, never repeating the vocab. You were just in Italy, unknowingly, sort of unconsciously, really picking it up. And now as a result, 25 years later, you're sitting there in Italy on your second trip and you realize, I actually recognize at least a little bit of this. Well, that's latent learning. It was not immediately reflected in your behavior. You were not immediately rewarded for it. And now, years later, you don't realize that you learned it. The other common example is room layouts or just geographical layouts. Obviously, you're not in my classroom right now, but if you were to close your eyes, I imagine you could pinpoint areas of my classroom, even if I've never quizzed you on this before. So, for example, I imagine many of you could identify where the American flag is. Well, that's something that you recognize pretty frequently. What about the Mr. Cognition statue? As of right now, it's sitting on the cabinets towards the left of the class, right above where the paper is. to the right of the hand sanitizer. There is in my classroom a poster of the Pied Piper. You might recognize where that is. It's to the right. That's typically where I stand, to the right of the podium. In my classroom right now, there is a picture of Freud. He's actually right above my shoulder. If I asked you to close your eyes and asked you to identify these regions of my classroom, you might be surprised at how well you do. Maybe you didn't recognize all of those locations, but you might have known a couple of them. Nobody ever quizzed you on the layout of my classroom, but that information still was learned at some point. So whether it's the layout of a classroom or whether it's just a little bit of foreign language you picked up on a trip to Europe, those are great examples of behaviors that you learn, but you don't realize you learn it until way later on when somebody asks you about it. I isolate the word late and latent learning and really think about the idea, this is later learning that happens but is not reflected until later on. If we were in class, I would ask for a volunteer to point out things in the class, but obviously we're not doing that through YouTube. The phenomenon of knowing the visual representation of one's layout in your head as a mental representation. So the layout of my classroom, the layout of the town, the layout of an area you visit, that mental representation of a geographical location is called a cognitive map. This is another great example of latent learning. Perhaps you've gone on vacation and you've driven by a coffee shop or a fast food place that you really like, and you're in the car and you don't really say anything out loud, but you notice it while driving by. And then an hour later, when you're at your destination, somebody asks, hey, does anybody know any good place to eat? And you say, you know what? About an hour ago, half hour ago, I remember driving by our favorite fast food restaurant. How about we go there? Nobody quizzed you on the geographical locations of the town that you're visiting, let's say in Florida, but you saw it. You made a quick note of it. Nobody quizzed you on it. And it wasn't until an hour later that somebody asked you about that material that you realized that it was actually learned. That's another great example of a cognitive map. You might be surprised how well you develop a mental representation of your surroundings, street names, store corners, all of the various elements of an area through the result of latent learning. That mental representation of a geographical location is called latent learning. The way that this was studied was using mice and a maze with cheese at the end, a really traditional study. What they did is they put a mouse into the maze with cheese at the end, and they let it, walk through the maze and eventually find the reward at the end. Then in a separate setting with different mice, they placed the mice into the exact same maze and just let it wander around. There was no reward at the end, just let it wander around, nothing at all. Then what was interesting was in phase 2. They put the mice back into each of the mazes and put food at the end. And what was really fascinating is each of the mice got to the end of the maze in basically the same amount of time. Why that's so surprising is, identifying the visual on the left, the mouse on the left originally had a reason to get to the end. It had a reward, it had positive reinforcement, specifically primary reinforcement with food at the very end. So it was incentivized to make its way to the end. That was not the case with the second mouse. The mouse in the second setting just walked around, wandered around. But nevertheless, they both picked up on the overall layout of the maze. They developed a cognitive map for the maze, even if the mouse in the second condition was never awarded. I want to note, these mice never observed each other. Occasionally, I ask a question about this, and one of the incorrect answers represents observational learning. These mice never saw each other. It's not like they observed one another go through the maze. Two totally different settings, two totally different trials. There was no observation between the mice. The reason that they learned the maze in basically the same amount of success was because they developed a cognitive map of the mental representation of their location.